Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. I hope you guys are doing well. This is week 6, and we have a essay due this week, and this is going to be a really short chapter and short lecture, and I'll just kind of go through it. I think probably the best way to understand this is to think about what we covered last week, which was World War One and the Great Depression, and everything we've been reading so far in this class is really been talking about these old empires changing, the old ways changing. And in this case, I think the best way to contextualize the old ways is to think of a world and countries that, especially in Europe and Asia, that are all ruled by monarchs or kingdoms. And these kingdoms and monarchs, even though we read, they went through so many changes and so many different empires and stuff, that they're vestiges of the past. And the reason that monarchies and absolutism and all these weird empires can come and go so quickly in these stories is because of lack of communication and illiteracy and huge geographic spaces. And I guess maybe the best way to think about that is if in your life today, even think about living in the United States, okay, or living in the Western world. We have instant communication for everything, and we have had it for 100 years now. We've had radio, and we've had print, and we've had the internet for a very short period of time, and so we, as modern citizens, don't even think about information and how important it is. But put yourself back in time to the 1500s or 1600s. There was absolutely no information. So you would live your entire life, perhaps as a peasant or as a farmer or as a bread baker in a rural area, and you would have no conceptualization of a government. You would have no conceptualization of the people or the society or the context. Your world is basically just going to church and doing your work, and you don't know about the outside world. And so when societies are in that space, that technological space where communication doesn't exist, then all of this history you read about, most of the people living during the time didn't even know what was going on. So as we read about it, and it's funny, so as we read about China and Japan, in the 1600s and the 1500s and the 1700s, the stuff we're reading about, the majority of the peasant population had no idea any of this was going on. They didn't know who the king was or anything. They just didn't know because their lives were totally localized because of lack of communication and lack of transportation. So I hope that helps, because a lot of this is like, what's the point? And then so now when we get into week 6, which is chapter 5, again, it's a little difficult for us as Westerners because it's talking about Asia and the Middle East and Latin America in this period of time between the two world wars. And I guess the thing to get out of it is that this is really a primer chapter for what's about to come. And let me kind of work through that. And I'm going to get a drink of water, excuse me. So the 3 words you should know, and this isn't going to be on an essay or anything, but you need to know this stuff just to be a better, more well-rounded person. So understand what nationalism is, what a dictatorship is, and what fascism is. And I think dictatorship, most of you know what that is. So that's a system of government that's a real absolute rule by one person. So we know what a dictatorship is. The classic example would always be Hitler. But even in North Korea, today, Kim Jong-il is a modern dictator, if you will. Putin is a modern dictator in the Soviet Union. Well, not the Soviet Union, but in Russia. So you know what a dictator is. Nationalism is unity because of common language or common culture or common customs or common religion. And so nationalism, can I give you an example of nationalism? A good example of nationalism is when at 9/11, when the planes flew into the World Trade Tower, all of the political polarization in the country stopped for a minute. And when the planes hit the World Trade Towers and the Pentagon, what we saw was a very divided Senate and House all come together and stand on the front steps of the Capitol and sing "America the Beautiful." These politicians who were totally arguing against each other all the time. They came together that moment because they all identify as Americans. So this idea of nationalism is when a group of people identify as Americans, and we in this country all identify as Americans. We also identify perhaps by the color of our skin or by our political affiliation or what have you. But we're all unified as Americans. And so nationalism is this idea that people in countries or in spaces where there really is no governance, they tend to come together around these commonalities and they try to identify as part of a group because that's the human condition. That's what we do. So there might have been the Ottoman Empire that had a very large area with a lot of countries included in the area, but the Ottoman Empire was a situation where someone in the north wouldn't ever say, "Hey, I'm an Ottoman," or somewhere in the south, near Greece, would say, "Hey, I'm an Ottoman," because the Ottoman Empire was imposed upon people, and when it started to break up after World War One, what you find is all of these little countries and regions within the Ottoman Empire that spoke the same language or that had the same customs or that went to the same church. So the rise of nationalism is this idea where someone comes along, a politician, and unifies people using a common characteristic, a common cultural characteristic. So that's what nationalism is. It's like, hey, we're Americans. And so the reason it's in this chapter is as these old monarchs were dissolving and these new countries were coming together, one of the reasons that they cohesed, one of the reasons that they came together was because of these commonalities. So nationalism is just a country or a group of people rising up and identifying as a certain kind of group, and it's normally based upon language. Okay, that's kind of the way it works, language and culture. So there's that dictatorship, and then fascism is difficult. I always say, nationalism plus a dictatorship equals fascism. It's a little formula. It's in my notes, and just know that fascism is Hitler. All right, that's what it is. It's an absolute government, an absolute leader. And the fascism part is authoritarian, and it's normally built around a national movement. And so again, Hitler's a great example. Mussolini in Italy is a great example of these guys that said, hey, we're all Germans, and Germany deserves the best place in the world, and so we're going to go attack all these other people because we are Germans and we are great, and the German people are going to win. And so that is this idea of fascism, where a dictator controls everything and makes pleas on the people based upon a common identity. So that's what it is. And again, I don't think there's any questions on it, but you should know. But fascism is like dictatorship, basically. So there's that part. Now, so there's a couple of things in here as you read through, and it's a good chapter. And I please learn. So what are the elements that sort of divide and unite societies? So ethnicity, linguistics, religion. And I want to key in on that religion part for a little bit as we move forward, because that's what we're going to talk about in the essay. Again, I'm reading my notes. So what are the elements that divide or unite society? So that would be ethnicity, linguistics, religion, and then why does nationalism occur in the Middle East and most other areas? Well, as you read through this chapter, the reason nationalism rises up, or the reason that movements rise up in countries, is normally a reaction to colonialism. In other words, England comes in and colonizes India and takes it over, okay, in the 1800s. And it's just a bunch of white guys going to India and saying, hey, we're taking over. So it's like the Europeans and the Native Americans here. So once a country takes over another country, the country that's being taken over, the country that's being controlled, like India in my example, they're not happy. I mean, it's like, hey, these people, these foreigners have come in and they're running our country, and we want them out. Well, that response to being colonized normally results in some sort of togetherness and nationalism. Like, we're all Indians, and we're going to fight these British and get them off of our continent. So that is important as you read through, that a lot of these new countries that you're reading about and these new formations of Iraq and Iran after the Ottoman Empire are reactions to colonialism. It's like, hey, Britain, You took over, Jordan, or you took over this peninsula, and the people there are not happy with you. So that is creating a movement. It's this idea of action reaction. The action is colonialism. The reaction is the people rising up to form their own country and their own identity under the guise of nationalism. So I hope that makes sense. Sort of the big events in this chapter. So the nationalist movement you'll read through, and then the INC. So the Indian National Congress is important. And Gandhi, you've heard of Gandhi. Maybe you don't know who he was, but he was a person in India who was beginning to build this protest against British rule. And Gandhi's very famous, and then Nehru followed him. So these guys were leaders of the movement for independence in India. And the reason that is important as you read on is that the INC, or the movement to coalesce Indians, had difficulties coming together, and the reason is because half of India is Muslim, and half of India, well, not half, but part of India is Muslim, and part of India is Hindu. And so even though these people are all identifying as Indians, which is cool, to get this independence movement going, because they have such great religious differences, the coalition can't come together. And that's going to be the key of the essay question this week, is how cultures and old traditions create difficulties for coalitions. And I'll explain a little bit more. So hopefully this is making sense. I'm going through it pretty quick. So read about Gandhi, read about Nehru. Gandhi's big deal was, nonviolent demonstration and civil disobedience. So he influenced Martin Luther King and other people in our culture a lot by his silent yet persistent protests. So he's an important guy. The Ottoman Empire falls in this chapter. And again, when you read about the Middle East and Palestine and the Zionist organization, and we get into the formation of Israel coming forward, it is a crazy story in our world to think that a country like Britain and a country like the U.S. and a country like France can go over to the Middle East and say, hey, we're going to divide these countries up, and here's what you're going to be. Here are a bunch of Christian European people dictating to Muslims in the Middle East where their borders are at, and where Israel is going to be, and it's astounding to me that these countries, including ours, have the temerity to come in and say we're superior, we're taking over, and knowing that's not going to go well, because people don't like being taken over by foreigners. So read about that. There's going to be a lot more to come about the Middle East. This chapter kind of puts us in a holding pattern, but it lets us know that the Ottoman Empire's gone, and Iran and Iraq are raising in their place, okay, for the most part. There's a lot more to it, but that's the overview. Let me get some more water. So probably the biggest thing in this chapter, as far as how it's going to affect world history, other than the Middle East, is you're going to read about something called the Comintern, and it's the Communist International Party. And if you remember from the last chapter, we studied the Russian Revolution, and we studied Marxism and this idea that Lenin is forming this communist empire in Russia. So this was last week. So now this week we see the Communist Party starting in Russia, forming this really solid worldwide organization and recruiting people from other countries to join the communist movement. And the reason it's the most important part of this chapter is because we don't know it yet, because we're in the early 1900s, but by 1947, 1948, the Cold War is going to start, and most of you, the Cold War was over by the time most of you were born. But just make a mental note, if you get nothing else out of this chapter, that communism is rising, and it's a force, and the reason it's important is because not only is it going to dictate in the future the Cold War, our relationship with what was the USSR, but also the China problem. So China's a communist country. It all happened. It all started back in this time with Mao Zedong, and you'll read about him a little bit in this chapter, and this is just the beginning of the story. So communism comes to China during this period of time, and also like today, right? We have North Korea, which is this, communist, isolated country. Well, again, Kim Jong Il's great grandfather or grandfather was trained in this Comintern, this Communist International Party. So what was going on with communism? And the rise of communism in Korea and China and Vietnam affects our world today in a huge way. So if I look at this chapter and say, okay, what's really important in here? That's the thing right there. The communism is the thing, and the Middle East is the thing. So there's going to be a lot more to come on that. Sorry this has taken so long. So as far as the essay this week goes, the essay question, and I actually don't have it written yet, but I will here shortly. But the essay question is going to ask you to provide 2 examples of nationalist or nation-building efforts that were hampered by religious or cultural influences. Okay, that's the question. So let me find a spot in the text, and I'll answer one of those for you. So again, the question is, to provide a couple of examples of nationalist or nation-building movements that were hampered by religious or cultural differences. So there's a bunch of examples in this chapter. So let me just go to, I'm going to go to page, let me go, I'm in page 114 in the book, and at the very top of page 114, in the first paragraph, there's a sentence that says, during the mid-19th century, one modernizing Shah attempted to introduce political and economic reforms, but faced resistance from tribal and religious forces. That is the answer. That is one of the answers to this question. Here's an example of a movement to modernize and form Iran, and that story starts on page 112. And a Shah of Iran comes in and starts to nationalize and reform the country, and does it based on Western standards. In other words, reforms such as some rights for women, or reforms to as Western style laws versus Sharia law, that sort of thing. But these movements often are stopped or are incomplete because of differences in religion. So on page 114, that's one of the examples. If you can provide an example of a nationalist movement, in this case Iran, being interrupted or hampered by religious or cultural phenomena. So again, in Iran, as they are trying to modernize, these old tribal and religious forces hamper this modernization effort. So that's the kind of thing I'm looking for. There's like 3 or 4 in here, and there's no right or wrong as long as you write it in such a way where you provide evidence and it makes sense. And again, this is one of those things that is going to be a real simple essay. It's going to be a couple of sentences long at most this week. Again, I just want you to understand the difficulty of forming a coalition of people in a very large geographic area. That there's sometimes there's peasants that you can't get on board because they don't understand what's going on. Sometimes religion interferes. Sometimes language interferes. Like we're trying to build a nationalist movement, but half the country doesn't speak my language. Well, that hampers development. So that could be an example also as you read through. So hopefully it's not confusing. The lecture went about 19 minutes. I apologize. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a great week. Be safe. Take care now. Bye.